Let's do the digestive system. This is a long chapter, and I feel like some of the stuff at the very end about like carbs and protein and lipids and stuff was just like way too much. So you'll notice the homework for this chapter kind of stops abruptly. We'll pick that stuff up next week when we go over nutrition and metabolism. But my advice is to really take this one kind of gently and maybe start with the anatomy, start with the lab stuff, and then kind of layer in the functions. There's a lot of hormones, there's a lot of regulation, there's a lot of feedback loops. It's just a little bit easier to do this in baby steps. So let's kind of just start with the global picture here and say that the digestive system is also known as the GI tract and the alimentary canal. And I think alimentary actually just means food tube. They're all synonyms. I kind of like the digestive system because it sounds like it's more of a system than just a tube. But what's really interesting, I think, about the human GI tract itself is that ours is actually pretty short. So when you compare like the intestinal lengths of like different animals, for example, you know how some animals eat all day and they're like eating grass or, bugs or something. Humans are uniquely adapted to find and produce highly nutritious food, and our GI tract is actually noticeably shorter than most animals. And we think that the energy that we don't have to spend on digestion because we can eat delicious, amazing food is invested into our brain, which is kind of cool. Anyway, you should just kind of know that ours is kind of short compared to a lot of comparative anatomies. We are going to talk about sort of the continuation from mouth to anus. So, everything from thinking about food to actually getting food in your mouth to the expulsion of the undigested contents, which is the feces. There is going to be a lot of anatomy here, everything from the mouth, the throat, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine. There's also a lot of organs that are going to have participation in digestion without being a primary organ. So there's just lots of juices being produced and secretions. It's just kind of a cool system, and it's huge compared to whatever we have studied in the past. So here's a weird dude with no eyes. I thought about putting eyes on him, but I don't know. Seemed kind of sacrilegious. We're going to start with the mouth. We'll review the three parts of the pharynx. At least the middle and the bottom part of the pharynx will play a role in swallowing. And then the esophagus, which kind of routes all of your solids and liquids into the stomach. And then from there, things get kind of twisty. There's lots of accessories, lots of little connections to things like the pancreas. And then, of course, the copious wrinkles of the small and large intestine. There's a lot going on in there. But it's pretty much the core of your abdominal contents, which it's kind of fun to tackle a big system once in a while. So let's kind of start with the processes. Ingestion is just, eating. You do this all the time. Don't you find that during these home like detention quarantines with COVID that like you think more about food than ever? Like, oh my God, I think about my meal plan all the time. It almost feels like I'm crazy. Anyway, we got to talk about eating, got to talk about drinking. We need to talk about the secretions that are going to chemically break down the contents of your food, in addition to mixing it. And, there's just a lot going into lubrication and moving things through. I mean, 7 liters of secretions per day. That is such an incredible amount of effort. We're going to digest most of those secretions back and get them back in terms of like all their components and reuse them for things, but I just find that such a big number. We will talk about the movement through the GI tract. The different portions of your digestive system are going to do different movements. So anything from chewing to swallowing to mixing and churning and peristalsis. I mean, there's pretty much a name for everything, but we want to move it from, start to finish. I really think that a good approach for this chapter is to break things down in that way. Is it a movement or a mechanical process? Like, is it like a churn? Is it a mix? Is it a, chop? Or is it a chemical reaction? Is it like hydrochloric acid breaking things down? Is it an enzyme breaking things down? Is it mucus, like secreting and lubricating? if you kind of think about being able to categorize everything into a movement or a chemical process, you'll be in really good shape. We'll also talk about absorption. This will be a segue for next week when we talk about nutrition and metabolism and stuff, but we got to get that nutrition out of the ingestibles and then into our bloodstream so that we can detoxify it and then use it for energy. And then not to be leaving out the expulsion process, we got to talk about poop, and that'll be at the very end. So let's just kind of start with the layers of the GI tract. This will be kind of a good second review from the lab video as well, but you can never see this like too many times. We've got that lumen layer, which is kind of our inner layer where we're going to have a whole variety of different types of epithelium, everything from simple squamous to simple columnar, you name it. A little bit of connective tissue, the lamina propria, you got to watch out if there's something special there. Just a thin strip of muscularis mucosa. I'm always thrilled when I see it because there are times when I'll see a histology sample where I can't make that out, but that's the border of the mucosa. Below that is the submucosa. That kind of makes sense, right? This is loose connective tissue. There's going to be vessels. There's going to be lymph, blood, nerves. This is kind of where all the goodies are. And for digestion in particular, we'll see that branch of the enteric nervous system, which services all of the digestive tract for the autonomic nervous system, embedded into the submucosa of the GI tract. The muscularis is just our smooth muscle that's going to have two perpendicular layers that both kind of squeeze in different directions so that we can get like a uniform, one directional flow, kind of a pinch behind whatever is being stretched so that it's moving forward. This will also, of course, because it needs some kind of innervation, have a branch of the autonomic nervous system. And then the serosa, which is really, it's just an outer wrapper. Usually I don't need to mention it. It's just a layer that you need to know is there. Now, in the respiratory system, I did mention that like the trachea, the outer layer is actually adventitia. The key difference between serosa and adventitia is actually the presence of fibers. It's not necessarily that it's all one above the diaphragm and one is below the diaphragm, although that's a pretty good rule. The serosa of the GI tract is very smooth and glistening like a wrapper, and adventitia tends to be more architecturally anchored with fibers so that things don't move. The exception to the above and below the diaphragm rule is going to happen in the urinary system, unfortunately. So I wish that this was a universal rule. It's a good rule, but a better rule is actually whether it's smooth and wet like an outer tube or if it's just kind of glued in place. Here's a nice random piece of intestine, it looks like. We have the mucosa layer with the random epithelium, doesn't even specify. There's a little bit of connective tissue, that's lamina propria, thin strip of muscle. Then we've got a deeper, more like robustly filled with little accessories and vessels. That's the submucosa, kind of brown in this picture. Two wrappers of the muscularis, lots of nerve endings all throughout there. And then that outer kind of whitish, like, I don't know, just surface membrane is the serosa. All right, let's start with the peritoneum, which, as you've probably already done the lab, the parietal is just the lining of the abdominal cavity, and the visceral is a whole hot mess. And so we've got these 5 individual pieces that we'll look at individually. You should know that these are sometimes the serosa, but not always. Like, it's such a random membrane system in the GI tract. It's kind of surprising. But it does help to just learn all 5 rather than, think that they're all uniform or whatever. So the other thing is there's a little bit of fluid and like space in the cavity between the visceral and the parietal membrane layers. It's certainly not like the intrapleural cavity space or the cardial space with the 2 heart membranes. It's just there's got to be a little bit of give inside the intestines. Things are going to move around in there. Things are going to flex and move and push and pull, and things are going to be moving through there. So we need a little bit of space, basically. So there will be a little cavity filled with a little bit of watery fluid. All right, let's start with the greater omentum. I'm just going to give a shout out to the greater omentum. This is the biggest, and this membrane is double folded. So it kind of comes down off of the greater curvature of the stomach, it comes down to the bottom of the abdominal cavity, and then it folds up and it comes back up. So if you were to do a cross section, you would actually be cross secting through both of those folds, which would have 4 layers instead of 2. It's got a lot of fat, and one of the things that I think is most interesting about the fat in the greater omentum is this is actually kind of cool. It tends to downregulate insulin receptors more than any other adipose in the body. So when you look at the criteria for type 2 diabetes, when people have a little bit of extra abdominal fat, tends to be a really strong indicator of diabetes because that particular belly fat just becomes insensitive to insulin. So that's kind of why people who are a little heavier are sometimes at more of a risk, or at least visually at risk, for not type 1 but type 2 diabetes. Anyway, it's also a really good place to look for lymph nodes because there's just tons of lymph nodes in that membrane. Those can indicate metastasis of cancer or whatever. The next one is the falciform ligament. This is the one that everybody always forgets is part of the peritoneum, but it's part of this membrane network in between the right and the left lobes of the liver. It's attached to the diaphragm from above. There's gonna be an attachment to the back body wall, but it's basically anchoring your liver in place. Your liver is fixed. The lesser omentum is going to be kind of the smaller turn of the stomach to basically the back area. And then the mesentery and the mesocolon are going to attach the small intestine and large intestine to the back of the body wall. So if you think your intestines are just loose in there like a hose and they can just kind of like squirt out, no. There is a lot of attachment of all of these different structures to all different places in the abdominal cavity. And if you've never seen a bariatric surgery, I would totally recommend you watch one online. It is crazy what they have to cut through to get to the stomach. It's so invasive. Anyway, here's a really cool picture from the book. This is kind of a cross-sectional view from above. And all of those kind of bluish green like tubes are basically parts of these membranes. So you can see how irregular it is. This is not how I choose to look at it. Usually I kind of like this front view of the greater omentum, the curtain over the belly, and then of course the falciform ligament you can see between the right and the left lobes of the liver. If we flip that liver up, you can see the lesser omentum, but the other two you kind of have to pull some stuff out. So to see the mesocolon and the mesentery, you'd have to flip that greater omentum up, kind of pull some of the guts out, and then you'd see that the small and the large intestine both have a really thick kind of, I don't know, opaque fatty membrane that is gluing them back to the posterior body wall. In terms of the mouth, you've got the buccal cavity, right? That's like buccal is cheek area and oral is kind of on the inside of your teeth. The lips are just soft, fleshy labia. Those are going to be attached with a thin central membrane right at the very top and bottom of your top and bottom lip. There's this little membrane that kind of holds your lips in place, kind of helps you control, the movement of your lips. Those are the labial frenula, or frenulum is the singular one. The vestibule is the space between the teeth and the lips. There's kind of some extra space for you to kind of chew things and manipulate things that are in your mouth. But the oral cavity proper is just on the inside of your teeth down to where basically you're going to swallow into the fauces. The salivary glands are in triple. You've got parotid right in front of your ear, you've got sublingual under the tongue, and then the submandibular on the right and left corner, kind of where that little corner of your jaw is. Saliva is actually, you guys, incredibly cool fluid. It is so protective in terms of having antibodies and antimicrobial substances. I mean, your saliva is, honestly, I would call it the defender of the oral cavity. When you don't produce saliva to the amount that you need it, like xerostomia is what that's called, it's like dry mouth, all sorts of horrible things can happen to you. You can be more prone to respiratory infections, more prone to like pneumonia. It's not just bad breath, but saliva is actually really interesting. The glands that produce the saliva, the parotid, produces just the watery portion of saliva, and the sublingual and the submandibular, produce a mixture of water and saliva. So even though they're all considered salivary glands, the parotid actually kind of does a slightly different version of saliva, which I think is kind of interesting. Here's a side-by-side view of the parotid on the left and one of the other salivary glands on the right. It's impossible to tell which one it is. You just know that it's not the parotid because it's got mucus and serous producing cells. Just a quick note about the stain color. It is absolutely irrelevant. They could be red, purple, pink, blue. I don't care. It's not like parotid is always going to be bluish purple. It's just that all the cells are uniformly homogeneous, whereas the submandibular and sublingual have mucus and serous glands, and so that combination tells you that it's definitely not the parotid, basically. In terms of saliva, we do need water. This is kind of a little bit of review from taste, right? Like you've got to actually dissolve the tastins. There's a little bit of solute stuff in there. There's some electrolytes. There's some gases. There's some neat stuff, but it is primarily water. Healthy saliva can range from like neutral to slightly acidic. When it gets really, really acidic, it can erode the enamel on the teeth, and that can be an indicator for tooth decay or cavities. But it actually depends on your diet. The more carbohydrates you eat, the more acidic your saliva is, basically. Oh, and the other thing that kind of shocks people is that sparkling 0-calorie water is super acidic. That can actually drop the pH of your saliva down by a couple pH like levels. It always surprises people that that's not like healthy. Anyway, you do produce about a liter, 1.5 liters of saliva like daily. Most of that you're gonna just reabsorb, like you're gonna digest the stuff in your saliva and get it back, and it is totally under the autonomic nervous system control. Like all you need to do to start like salivating is think about something amazing. Like think about food. I know I kind of miss going out. Like I haven't gone anywhere really. I've been really good, but I do miss going out to eat sometimes. I thought about getting a pizza. But anyway, I just kind of wigged myself out and then I didn't do it. And I guess I can make pizza. But like, all I have to do is think about like this Scotty's pizza. Ugh. Why? Anyway, I'll get myself under control. The tongue has lots of muscles. There's going to be some that are voluntarily controlled, some that are also autonomically controlled. The lingual frenulum is like that little membrane that holds the posterior surface, the bottom of your tongue, down to the floor of your mouth, basically. The dorsal surface, the top of your tongue, is really weirdly textured. I want you to know that the tongue is just as much a touch sensor as it is a taste sensor. So remember the spiky filiform papillae, the kind of sharp, weird textural ones. Like if you have a cat, you know what I'm talking about because they're really sharp. Like cats' tongues are weird. Those are 100% touch. And I actually think this is really interesting about American like eating, is that we tend to eat kind of fast, and the manipulation of food, the texture of food, the touch of food, the experience of just like manipulating that food is really important. Your hypothalamus has a little bit of a satisfaction delay. So you don't even realize you're full until 10 minutes after. Like for me, I'm like, oh God, I just one more bite of sushi. And then I'm like, so much regret, right? And then, you can't take it back. But like if you just slow down, that touch gives feedback to the hypothalamus, and it's like mindfulness. You know what I mean? I think it's really interesting that we've kind of lost track of that part of food. There are some lingual glands that are part of the tongue that can kind of also participate in the chemical digestion of fats and also lubrication of food. But the tongue is just kind of it's a weird, cool muscle. Remember, it's the only one without an insertion. Anyway, here's a nice tongue. You can see a lot of those valate or circumvallate papilla are towards the very back of the tongue. Those are loaded with taste buds. The surface of the tongue, though, like remember, it's not mapped for taste. It just has lots of different types of sensors for the different chemical components of what you're eating, and then um, and not just the taste of it is what I'm thinking, but also the texture of it. Also, I want to kind of point out that lingual tonsil in the very, very back is the super base of the tongue. So that's a tonsil. A lot of people don't know that you have a tonsil as part of the back of your tongue, but you got two, adenoids, two like palatine tonsils, and then you've got one at the base of your tongue, which is really, really big. So even if you've had all your tonsils removed, you're still lucky that you got the lingual. All right, let's talk more about teeth. So the dentes are kind of in these little pockets in the mandible or the maxilla. We've got a couple parts of a tooth, kind of the top portion of the tooth, the crown, which is above the gum line, the neck, which is going to insert into the gum line, and then the root, which is really reinforced into the socket so that it stays attached. The gingiva are your gums, and I think in the lab video I mentioned these should be nice and pink. They should not bleed under normal probing or brushing. Got to take really good care of your gingiva because there's lots of blood vessels and you don't want there to be bleeding or whatever. There's a teeny tiny little periodontal ligament which should anchor the teeth and keep those teeth nice and secured. There are also going to be a little bit of a shock absorber pad so that if you do kind of crunch on something hard, it's not going to break your tooth immediately. It's going to kind of give it a little bit of flex. If you've ever had your hygienist wiggle your teeth and kind of give them a measurement of how loose they are, it's very disturbing. But there's times when a little bit of flex is normal. You just don't want them to fall out. I will say that the basic structure of a tooth is dentin. That surrounds the pulp cavity, which is the living part of the tooth, really. That's where the vessels and the lymph and the nerves are, all the sensitivity. The crowns, where you kind of see the teeth inside your mouth, are covered in enamel. And enamel it's not the strongest substance in the human body, but it is the hardest, which is great because the enamel is very difficult for microbes to metabolize. It's not impossible, I wish it was, but it certainly is a layer of protection from all of the bacteria in the mouth, and there are so many bacteria in the mouth. Don't even get me started. Here's a nice tooth. You can see the crown on the surface covered in the white enamel. You should know that fluoride makes enamel stronger when it develops, so it's even better than the calcium based bonded enamel that you're born with, or that you develop, I guess, shortly after you're born. You're not born with your teeth, I would hope not. The neck is just tucking into the gingiva, and then the root is kind of the little feet of the teeth. This is a pretty nice tooth. I think it looks pretty good. You do have two sets of teeth. Your baby teeth are referred to as the deciduous teeth. It's kind of like trees that lose their leaves. Usually you start to acquire a tooth around 4 to 6 months, and then you get one every few months for quite a while until they're replaced. Deciduous teeth do not have roots. I mean, I don't really remember what it feels like to lose a tooth, but I remember it didn't hurt really that bad. Your adult teeth are more like integrated into your skull, and losing those might actually be a little bit of some suck. Remember that in a perfect world, a perfect mouth, you would have all of your teeth, which we would see divided into quadrants, would have the formula 2, 1, 2, 3, 2 incisors, 1 canine, 2 premolars, and 3 molars per quadrant. So you would multiply all of those numbers by 4 to get the total number of teeth that you could potentially have, which would be 32. I'll say not everybody has all of their teeth. A lot of people have their third molars or their wisdom teeth removed. I actually only had 3 wisdom teeth come in. I had them removed because I had lots and lots of braces. I actually had a 10 millimeter overbite revision, which was crazy. It totally changed my face. But it also really messed up my bite pattern, and one of my biggest problems, this is totally aside, sorry, you can skip ahead. I have ground off all of the surface of my teeth because my mouth doesn't fit together anymore. And even though I wear a night guard and stuff, like I just had really hard time with like the amount of movement that my teeth got from my orthodontist. And I'm really grateful that I had braces, don't get me wrong. I was kind of fugly looking. Uh, but I really am bummed that my teeth are just like wearing down. Anyway, I was at the dentist. The only other place that I've been to in quarantine was the dentist when she opened back up again. And she's like, "Oh, you should wear your night guard, Valerie." And I'm like, "Oh my God, I always wear my night guard. I can't sleep without it." And she's like, "Well, I think you should wear one during the day." And I'm like, "Oh my God, I can't just go around all day, 24 hours a day with a fucking night guard and day guard in my mouth." I was just like, "Are you kidding me?" Anyway, I'm just going to go in and fix my broken tooth, and I'm not going to wear a day guard because that's just not going to happen. Anyway, end of story. Let's talk about some mechanical and chemical digestion processes in the mouth. First, we gotta chew that food, and that has a special name, that's mastication. Chewing is actually more technical than you think. It is not just chopping things up, it's chopping things up into a swallowable form, which is kind of like just a soft oval of stuff called a bolus. There are two enzymes that come from saliva, and this is kind of a key point here. Your chemical breakdown starts in the mouth. A lot of people don't give your mouth enough credit, but there are two enzymes, amylase and lipase. There are other enzymes later on that will do the same things, but you'll actually see that simple sugars are actually broken down in the mouth. In fact, really simple sugars you can absorb in the mouth, which is kind of interesting. Like you can totally get sugar absorbed through, your gingiva and your tongue and, all of the blood vessels inside your oral cavity. So that's definitely doable. The lingual lipase, you're not really going to have time for it to stay in the mouth for fat breakdown, which takes a long time. But we actually do see that one of the enzymes coming from saliva is like a fat digester. I will say that the lingual lipase doesn't last very long because it gets broken down in the hydrochloric acid, but hey, it's there. I have to mention it. Next, we have the pharynx, and swallowing is deglutition. So we've got mastication in the mouth, we've got deglutition, which is really just swallowing. And swallowing actually has three phases, and it kind of makes sense if you think about it. There's a point where you can put your bolus into the back of your throat, but if you can take it back, you're in the voluntary stage, all right? And there is like a point of no return that transitions into the pharynx, and we'll see that the skeletal muscles are going to transition into smooth muscles. So you can control the skeletal muscles at the top of the throat, but you cannot control voluntarily the smooth muscles. That's just a reflex. So the pharyngeal stages, you no longer can take it back. It's just going to go down no matter what. And then by the time it reaches the esophagus, it's basically all just peristalsis. It's all 100% autonomic nervous system controlled. Here's kind of what that looks like. We've got the voluntary phase, and I would just say you can put it back as far as you can. And if you can take it back, that's basically voluntary skeletal muscles. And then there's sort of this pharyngeal transition into a reflex for deglutition, and then boom, the esophagus takes over. The esophagus itself is really just a muscular tube. It's stretchy. It's definitely going to expand with the size of your bolus. And some people swallow big, some people swallow small. I am kind of a small swallower, and because I'm tongue-tied, which is the lingual frenulum under my tongue is a little bit longer than some people's, like it kind of comes out a little bit further and holds my tongue down a little bit, I guess. It is easier for me to swallow if I'm also sort of drinking something liquid, but I mean, whatever. Like, there's just a range of us weirdos. Anyway, the esophagus is stratified squamous epithelium. It's definitely going to have a lot of friction. It's definitely going to have a lot of sloughing. It's going to have a very regenerative property. There are some glands in the submucosa, and I always think about it like if something gets stuck in your esophagus, like sometimes you just have to give it a second or two, and then those glands kind of like start to lubricate that, and it just gets easier to swallow. The muscularis, like I said, is going to transition from skeletal to smooth muscle, and because we're above the diaphragm, this will be considered adventitia. Also, This is going through the mediastinum, right? That whole mediastinum is just full of fibers. So like the heart stuff, the trachea stuff, it's all just glued together. Physiology of the esophagus, we'll see functionally it doesn't secrete a lot of stuff other than mucus. And that's cool because it's just a tube. We just want it to kind of like conduit, like connect from the mouth to the stomach. The upper esophageal sphincter, can I just say that that's not really what I would consider a true sphincter? It's more of a closure. It's more of like where the sides of the esophagus just kind of collapse together and form just a little bit of a like a narrow gate. It's very easy to get stuff to splash up through things that are not true sphincters, which will be a disease later on. Peristalsis is always the coordinated, unidirectional, rhythmic contraction of smooth muscle that we see in any hollow tube. So this is not specific to the esophagus, but peristalsis is definitely how we regulate and coordinate a downward movement from the mouth to the stomach. Just above the diaphragm, we have another narrowing. Like the other stuff, it's not what I would consider a really awesome sphincter with like a little circular closure of muscle. It just kind of relaxes against itself. If that one splashes acid, that's what acid reflux feels like, and it basically feels like a heart attack, like just really burny in the inside of your chest. It's pretty bad, but the problem is it's weak anatomy. It's not like that anything's wrong with your stomach. It's just like your little closure is not very good. Swallowing depends on what you're swallowing. It's faster if it's liquid, it's slower if it's solid, slowest if it's dry. You know the drill. Try it at home. Most of the time it works pretty well. Here's just a picture of some peristalsis. Remember, smooth muscle contracts really slow. So like once it stretches, it gets the bolus in there, then it stretches, and then it's got this little kind of intrinsic delay, and then it squeezes, and that pushes the bolus forward. And because of that slow delay, this is always one way. All right, let's talk about the stomach. We've got this big bag that's roughly J-shaped. It does hold a lot of stuff. Like, some stomachs can be stretched out more with, competitive eating or whatever. But I would say like a liter. That's pretty good storage. It definitely is muscular and can mix things all slushy through there. Like I said, it can stretch. It's probably not super happy, super distended, but that's how we eat in this country. Digestion of a lot of stuff is going to occur here, but I want to be really careful because digestion does not mean absorption, okay? Absorption is different. That means it's going into your blood. This is just breakdown. So we're going to basically deconstruct the carbohydrates, proteins, and triglycerides. It might not be completely deconstructed chemically. There's going to be a lot of enzymes that participate in that chemical digestion. The whole idea, though, is we want to liquefy whatever you have swallowed. So our little oval bolus is going to be turned into this really rich, thick chyme substance. And it's the chyme that is going to be squirted into the small intestines. We will also need to kind of regulate how much of that chyme goes into the duodenum because the small intestine is much smaller in diameter than the stomach. So what we want to do is like mix up and churn and liquefy all of that food and stuff and then squirt a few mils of that chyme into the duodenum at a time so we don't overwhelm it and create a little bit of a backflow. The anatomy, we've got the top of the stomach is where the esophagus is going to attach. That's where the cardia is, and it's not a special structure. It's just where the tip of the heart is. The fundus is that kind of extra little superior pouch, and then we've got the body, which is the vertical portion, and the pylorus, which in this illustration in textbook it's referred to as specifically just the pyloric antrum and the canal, but those are two parts of the pylorus. So the antrum is kind of the very bottom of the stomach, and then it sort of narrows into a canal, and then it forms a true sphincter. And I mean, this is like a real sphincter. It totally closes. So what's really cool, you guys, about the pyloric sphincter, remember that there's a third layer of smooth muscle in the stomach. There's that inner layer that is kind of in a random direction. It's the oblique layer of smooth muscle. That smooth muscle layer forms the pyloric sphincter. It's so cool. Anyway, and then we got the greater curvature. That's where my greater omentum is hanging off, and the lesser curvature on the inside, the smaller curve, that's where the lesser omentum would be attached. Now, here's the thing about the stomach histology. The mucosa, the surface of the stomach, is flat. It is a type of simple columnar epithelium, but it is covered with mucus, so it looks kind of blurry. But it is simple columnar, one layer of kind of tall cells, and the glands, the gastric glands, are located in the lamina propria. It's a good review from labs. Let's take a look at this under the microscope. Here's a nice view. You can see that those are all just little gastric pits, little kind of cavities and holes that basically descend into this huge branchy network of like glandular cells that are going to produce hydrochloric acid and enzymes, all sorts of good stuff. Speaking of gastric glands, we've got three types. We've got mucus cells. We need that to protect the surface epithelium of the stomach from the hydrochloric acid, right? Mucus is alkaline, so it actually is a really great neutralizer and keeps those cells protected. We have chief cells, and I've always remembered that chief cells are like in charge, right? And what's most important about the stomach is actually chemical digestion. So the chemical digestion is coming from enzymes, and those are going to be pepsinogen. Pepsinogen is just inactivated pepsin. Anytime you see an inogen, it means it's a precursor form. We actually practice with that terminology with blood clotting stuff. I know it's been a while. And, apocalypse. But hear me out. We don't want to have active protein digesting enzymes inside of a cell. We want it to not actually function until it gets out into the stomach. So it's in its precursor form, and gastric lipase is going to do the job of what the saliva started and could not finish. The parietal cells produce the hydrochloric acid. Of course, that's important because the hydrochloric acid is going to kill microbes, and it's going to start to beat up the protein and denature things and just loosen things up for digestion. Also, this is kind of cool. It is what usually is the activator of those precursor enzymes. So if you think about it, this is rad. It's like a different cell produces something else that activates the thing that could digest the cell that's producing this enzyme. It's so neat. Anyway, if we combine all of that stuff, we would call that gastric juice. So gastric juice is mucus, a bunch of enzymes, and a bunch of acid. But what's awesome about gastric juice is you produce a ton of it every day, 2 to 3 liters. Remember how we started with having to inventory all of these like 7 liters of secretions? And I was like, wow, that seems like a lot. Okay, well, we're 1.5 in for saliva. Now we've got another 2 to 3 of just this like mucousy enzyme acid juice. That's a lot. And as a bonus, I'm just going to add that pyloric antrum produces a hormone, gastrin. This hormone does not go into the stomach, it goes into the blood, and it will actually regulate digestion. And one of the things that has always made me remember gastrin is that gastrin is a hormone that gets the gastric juices flowing. It's going to increase secretion of that stuff. It's going to move the stomach so that it mixes its stuff into chyme. It just keeps the gastric juices and movements going. But it's just that weird little bottom of the stomach that has these endocrine cells that shoots that hormone gastrin into the blood. It's just kind of cool. It'll come up again in part 2 when we talk about how it's all regulated. All right. Now, we've only really called out the mucosa with like these gastric glands and stuff. We still have the submucosa. Nothing special there. We do have that crazy third layer of muscle. Don't forget that. It's very unique to the stomach. And the serosa is what I would consider unremarkable. All right, let's talk about mechanical digestion in the stomach. One of the great things you could do to practice digestion of the stomach is drink a glass of water before you go to bed and then lay down and listen to it slush. Like it literally will slush from side to side. That is a mixing wave. A mixing wave is just kind of this rhythmic back and forth wave that's just like an ocean wave. It's just kind of mixing things inside the stomach. It's gonna get things mixed in there with the acid and the enzymes. It's not a really violent stomach contraction. But every, I don't know, 20 seconds or so, you can kind of hear water move from one side to the other. It works especially well on an empty stomach, I might recommend. Anyway, the whole idea is that eventually, once it gets liquefied, one of those waves will be responsible for kind of pushing a little bit of chyme into the small intestine. Now, in terms of chemical digestion, I want to kind of start with hydrochloric acid. How does your stomach produce hydrochloric acid? It clearly cannot produce hydrochloric acid that's pH 2 inside of the cells. That would be completely acid disaster. We're going to see the hydrogen and the chloride produced in two different places. And this is sort of the, academic description of this. But I want to show you this visually, and normally I would have you draw this, but I'm going to try to do it on the PowerPoints. But the whole idea is we got to get strong acid. It's a protection, right? Like it keeps you from having pathogens and poisons inside your stomach. It also is going to break things apart. So let's kind of do this one at a time from just where we start. So we have the parietal cell, right? Which is the cell that's responsible for the production of hydrochloric acid. It does a couple other things with intrinsic factor too, but that's not as important to me. Now we have the cell in between two places, the inside of the stomach on one side, and then a blood capillary on the other. Now, this parietal cell is alive. It's producing CO2. That carbon dioxide is in the presence of water. And one of the things you might remember from last quarter is that your cells all have this carbonic anhydrase enzyme that takes CO2 and water and turns it into an unstable carbonic acid, which immediately dissociates into a hydrogen and a bicarbonate. Right? This is totally respiratory system. We saw this actually in a few other places, but like last week was just last week, right? So all you have to do is be alive as a parietal cell. You're going to produce CO2. And then as part of this reaction, that CO2 is transformed into an acid and a bicarb. Now, what we want to do with that acid, just kind of starting from that place, is pump it into the inside of the stomach, right? Because hydrochloric acid is HCl. So this is half of it, but notice that it has a positive charge. We can't just pump positive charges and then stay electrically neutral. We learned that in the nervous system. We have to have some kind of a balancer. So what we'll see is that potassium is moved in the opposite direction as the hydrogen. But one of the weird things about the potassium is that it will just leak right out, and it is just recycled. So it just goes round and around and around and around. But what we've accomplished is now we've basically got the hydrogen inside the stomach. We're halfway there. Now let's deal with that other half of the reaction, the bicarb. The bicarb is actually going to accumulate and it will be pumped into the blood. Now notice that the bicarb has a negative charge, so we can't just pump a bunch of negativity into the blood unless we want a super disaster. We want to keep it balanced. So we'll see that this chloride has a negative charge. We can pump bicarb into the blood and chloride out of the blood into the parietal cell where it accumulates, and then it just leaks down its concentration gradient into the stomach. But hey, we've made our hydrochloric acid. So that slide with all of the steps is basically just telling you where the hydrogen comes from and where the chloride comes from. They're actually kind of complicated paths, but it sort of makes sense if you remember the chloride shift from blood and some of that respiratory reactivity.